Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic of today's webinar is replacing New York City's peaker plants with clean alternatives, progress barriers, and pathways forward. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group on behalf of the Peak Coalition. We have many members of the Peak Coalition here with us today, and you'll be hearing from them in just a moment. Before I pass it over to our exciting panel, I'd like to go over a few very quick webinar logistics. If you would like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled here. And you can also click on that arrow to expand your webinar console. One thing you might like to do with that webinar console is to type in your questions and your comments. We will save at least 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. Do type your questions in. Can't do a Q&A without them. So final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording today or tomorrow, also a copy of the slides, and those will be posted on Clean Energy Group's website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So with that, I will now pass it over to my colleague and our moderator for today's webinar, Seth Mullendore. Seth is President and Executive Director of Clean Energy Group.
Okay. Thank you, Sam, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. As Sam mentioned, this webinar is brought to you by Clean Energy Group. We are a national nonprofit advocacy organization. We work across the country to provide innovative solutions to enable a more equitable energy transition with a mission to enable affordable, reliable, clean energy for all. We work across a number of areas, including climate resilience and community health, distributed energy access and equity, energy storage and flexible demand, and fossil fuel replacement, which is the focus of this webinar. So the next slide, please. The initiative that's under this webinar is our Phase Out Peakers group, which the Peak Coalition is a portion of that work. The Phase Out Peakers work is just a more national scope project to accelerate the transition of polluting fossil fuel power plants, specifically those that operate not a lot and are closer located to population centers. The majority of peakers in the country, and there are over 1,000 in operation, are located in low-income communities, and some of the dirtiest ones are concentrated in communities that have higher proportions of people of color. So this webinar today is about a report that Peak Coalition recently released, just out last month, called Accelerate Now, the Fossil Fuel Endgame 2.0. I will go into that a little bit more once we start the slides up, but just so you know, that is available both on the Clean Energy Group website and the Peak Coalition website as well. Okay, so I think with that, let's go to the speaker slide. So we have a great lineup for you today. I'm going to kick things off to run through some of the findings from that report and some of the power plants we're talking about. I'm joined by 4 of my colleagues from the Peak Coalition, Victor Davila, the community organizer with the Point CDC, Sebastian Baez, just a transition coordinator with UPROSE, Daniel Chu, energy planner with New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and Megan Carr, who's in the Skadden Fellow Environmental Justice with the New York Lawyers for Public Interest. So their full bios, we didn't have enough time to really go through the full bios, but in the handouts, if you look on your dashboard, there's a handout that includes everybody's full bio. So please do check that out for more information about all of our speakers today and the great organizations that they represent. All right, with that, we'll transition to the slides for today. And as Sam said, this is a presentation of the Peak Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations focused on replacing peaker power plants in New York City. The Peak Coalition came together in 2019, officially launched with a release of our first report in 2020. Peak Coalition is made up of UPROSE and the Point CDC, which are 2 community-based organizations in New York City. where peaker plants are located, the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and Clean Energy Group. The coalition aims to end the longstanding pollution burden of these peaker power plants on the city's most climate vulnerable people, and brings together the technical expertise, legal expertise, public health, and planning expertise that is needed to really accelerate this transition, and also to propel and advance the implementation and development of clean alternatives. So whether that's transmission lines or renewables, solar and wind, offshore wind's big for New York City, battery storage, demand response, all of these things that can accelerate and have a clean transition from the city's polluting fossil fuel power plants. So Accelerate Now is the new report released last month. It's called the Fossil Fuel Endgame 2.0 because this is a companion follow-up report to a report that the Peak Coalition released some years ago called the Fossil Fuel Endgame 2.0. That report put together a comprehensive strategy to replace New York City's fossil fuel power plants completely by 2030 with clean alternatives, focusing mostly on distributed solar, offshore wind, energy efficiency, and battery storage. Found that all of the city's peaker plants could be replaced and meet demand by 2030 with a mix of those resources, and result in $1 billion in energy system savings, as well as an additional $1 billion worth of environmental and health savings over the next decade. So Accelerate Now is a check-in on the progress made since 2019 when the coalition was established, looking at what has happened to the fleet of fossil fuel power plants in New York City since then, what's been helping accelerate that progress, and challenges impeding the progress. So here's the big takeaway from the report in this graphic. So the good news is that out of the essentially 6 gigawatts of fossil fuel peaker power plants that were in place in 2019, these are mostly gas and oil peakers. About 2/3 of them have either retired at this point or announced retirement. The bad news is that most of those are announcements of plans to retire. And as it stands right now, 75% of that fossil fuel peaker capacity, about 4.5 gigawatts worth, may still be online beyond 2025, when the state has implemented the stronger emissions limits for these power plants, which I'll get into in a minute here. So this is the laying the groundwork of how this transition really was jump-started, and part of the history of the Peak Coalition coming together. There were 2 major actions that were taken by the state that enabled this transition to really start moving forward. The first, which those of you that are working in New York will know very well, is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA, also called the Climate Act, Climate Law. The big takeaways from this includes a lot of things, but for the energy sector, it is that New York State must reduce economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2025. For the electricity sector, that's 70% renewable electricity by 2030 and a fully zero-emission electric grid by 2040. That word zero emission, that term is very important. It's not saying just zero greenhouse gases, but zero emissions of any kind, which includes co-pollutants. Also established very significant and ambitious targets for solar, energy storage, and offshore wind, and really recognized that environmental justice is key to the transition process. The other major step that was taken was the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York implemented what is called the peaker rule. This is an emission standard for nitrogen oxide emissions from peaker plants. Basically, New York City was looking at non-attainment for NOx emissions. And so this was put in place in order to lower ozone development and unhealthy air specifically during the ozone season, during the summertime. Basically, this impacted about, I believe it was over 3 gigawatts of peaker plants, and forced those power plants to put a plan in place for how they were going to eliminate emissions during that time or reduce them below a threshold that they would have difficulty meeting. So this is just a snapshot of the 2019 look at the power plants in New York City, peaker plants, which represents most of the fossil capacity in the city. There are 19 fossil fuel power plants. They are, as I said, there's about 6 gigawatts of generation. A lot of these are more than 50 years old, which is way past the retirement date for how these power plants initially were intended. The average age is about 40 years old, which again is quite old for these types of power plants. The shaded area in here shows at that time what were identified as communities of color within New York City and low-income communities. Within a 1 mile radius of these power plants, there's about 750,000 New Yorkers. The majority of those are either low income or people of color. Many of them are both. The snapshot of where we are today is here. There's a lot on here, so I am going to break this down a bit more, going through the power plants owner by owner. But what you can see is there has certainly been progress. So those power plants in gray have been retired, and that represents about 700 megawatts of fossil fuel capacity. And in each case, that retirement is being coupled by a transition to cleaner resources, whether that's battery storage development or facilitation of offshore wind. As I said, another, about 2/3 of the power plants have announced some sort of transition. So that's the green and blue shaded power plants here. So those in the darker green have a transition in process, which means they've made some really tangible forward movement. In some cases, this means that they have actually notified the system operator that they plan to deactivate at least some of the units, some of the peaking units at the site. A couple of them are lighter shaded. This represents 2 power plants, Gowanus and Narrows, which are both in Sunset Park. Those had started their transition or announced their transition, but their life has been extended due to a reliability concern in 2025 that there might not be enough capacity to meet demand in that time, which we'll talk about more later on. Those in blue have at least announced some sort of plan or submitted some plan for how they're going to transition away from fossil fuels at those peaker plant sites, but there hasn't really been a lot of forward movement yet. In some cases, more than others. We've got a few red ones in there, and those really this time that we don't know what their transition plan is. The majority of those are larger steam turbine power plants, which are not subject to the emissions rule and are not facing that same force to transition their power plants along the 2025 date that was set in place for those lower emissions limits. So I'm going to walk through these fairly quickly here so that we can get to the other speakers, but I just wanted to give a sense of how the different owners of these power plants have approached their compliance with both the CLCPA and the emissions rule, the peaker rule from DC. So to start with NRG, which is a bit of a kind of textbook for opposition that turned out well in the end. We have 3 power plants here. Again, the steam turbine, we don't know what's going on. A smaller one called Arthur Kill may be replaced by a transmission line that's coming into place. I'm going to focus on the Astoria gas turbines. This is a large and very old facility, over 500 megawatts. NRG had first proposed to repower this site with new gas turbines. Peak Coalition, along with others, fought against this, saying that it was not consistent with the CLCPA to add gas, even if it was a repowering or more efficient turbines for less efficient turbines, which is what NRG was arguing. Ultimately, the DEC did rule in line with the Peak Coalition, saying that the repowering plans to add new gas turbines was inconsistent with the CLCPA. And later on, the NRG announced the sale of this site to be redeveloped for offshore wind interconnection. So this is a great success story, a transition that those peakers have been shut down at this point and are being redeveloped for offshore wind. So the clean energy transition as it should look ultimately. Eastern Generation has several power plants across New York City. The Gowanus and Narrows plants I mentioned earlier. So the Astoria generating station is one that has submitted a deactivation notice to the system operator, and there's an intention to build battery storage there. And we don't know what the steam turbines, which is a large power plant. Gowanus has had half of its capacity deactivated at this point. The other half, 320 megawatts, is being kept online for that reliability need. So it's being extended beyond the 2025 deadline for emissions reduction by what's called a reliability must run, where they're saying we need this power plant for reliability. The Narrows, it's the same thing. Both of those sites were intended to be replaced by battery storage, and the owner of those sites, Eastern Generation, also called Alpha Gen recently, they have signaled their intent to still replace those with batteries, but because of this perceived reliability concern, that is being delayed. Even though the state, the city, and everyone else had a lot of time, several years, to plan for this eventuality, they are staying online right now as it is. But the coalition is working to make sure that that doesn't happen. So the next one is the New York Power Authority. They have a number of smaller, newer power plants. They have 6 sites within New York City, and they have announced that they have plans to phase those out. Originally, they said by 2035. They have been directed by the governor's office to transition those by 2030. And they did release a request for proposals for battery storage at a number of the sites, and are in the process of evaluating those, and we think selecting some bids to move forward. So we're hoping to have some good news on that front soon, although no steps have been taken to actively deactivate those peaker plants. Finally, second to last, Rise Light and Power. This is the largest fossil fuel facility in New York City. It represents around 2 gigawatts of generation across multiple turbines. With this one, there is a plan in place. Rise Light and Power has put forth a plan to transition the majority of fossil fuels at the site to renewables through a number of different pathways, including offshore wind development, battery storage development, and interconnection with renewables in other parts of the state. They did win a solicitation for offshore wind, or they were part of a solicitation, which should result in closure of one of the large turbines. You see the kind of 3 clustered together in the picture. They're below one of those 400 megawatts turbines should be able to be deactivated once offshore wind is interconnected into that site. Finally, I've consolidated Edison, Con Ed, which provides power to most of New York City and surrounding areas. They have a number of power plants as well. So a couple of those are in the retired category. One's being retired by a transmission line that negated the need for the power plant, the 74th Street. Another site is being redeveloped for offshore wind interconnection, Hudson Avenue. That was another recent winner of offshore wind solicitation. And then we don't know what's going on with the steam turbine facility, their largest facility, and the 59th Street could be potentially closed by a transmission line, but that's still a little bit unknown at this point. So that was a rather quick overview of what the landscape looks like now. As I said, there's progress, which is great and is encouraging, but we're still running into a lot of barriers. So before I pass it over, I'm just going to encourage folks to please submit your questions as you have them. As we said, we'll leave a good amount of time at the end to address those, but don't save them all for the end. Please put them into the question box as you think of them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian to talk about community perspectives.
Hi all, and thank you, Seth, for that overview. I think the big picture is very important, and I will be speaking on the Sunset Park UPROSE perspective, really looking at how these peaker plants impact people on the ground. So a little bit about UPROSE, for those who haven't heard, we are an intergenerational, multiracial, nationally recognized, women of color-led grassroots organization that promotes sustainability and resilience through community organizing, education, leadership development, and cultural artistic expression in Brooklyn, New York. And the mission of environmental justice is core to UPROSE, it not necessarily since its founding in 1966, but definitely since the 90s, when a lot of environmental justice issues were raised by the Sunset Park community. And so for a little bit of context for those who don't know where Sunset Park is, what it's about, it's a working class industrial waterfront community of 135,000 in Brooklyn, New York. So in addition to having an industrial waterfront where a lot of manufacturing, heavy industry, transportation is located, it also has a dense residential upland sector where a lot of people live. And these people are 38% Latino, 27% Asian, and 23% below the poverty line. So as Seth mentioned, a lot of the people here are part of the 750,000 who are low income or communities of color across the city. And what makes Sunset Park an environmental justice community, not just a low income community of color? Well, it's the unfairly sited polluting infrastructure that is so close to where people live. So I give this as a context to what peakers mean in terms of our work and why the work of Peak Coalition is so important. So the interstate highway, the I-278, otherwise known as the Gowanus Expressway or the BQE, Brooklyn Queens Expressway, that carries 130,000 vehicles daily and approximately 13,000 trucks each day, which translates to about 90 vehicles per minute. So just from this, we see there's a lot of truck traffic and of course, diesel pollution and other emissions from that massive infrastructure that runs right through the heart of Sunset Park. In addition to this, there are several waste management facilities where residential household trash, as well as recycled goods, are trucked and moved and stored. And in addition to this, last mile truck distribution centers. So if you're thinking about packages they're getting from Amazon or FedEx, or even groceries and food from City Harvest or Fresh Direct, all of that comes to Sunset Park and stays in Sunset Park on trucks. And again, these trucks, they emit diesel pollution, and all of this creates negative impacts on the air quality that residents breathe. So in addition to these transportation facilities and polluting infrastructure, we have the peaker plants. And these peaker plants, as I'll explain, are a big part of why UPROSE and Sunset Park have fought for clean energy, just transition in the waterfront. So again, the infrastructure that is unfairly sited in Sunset Park, you don't see this infrastructure in wealthier and wider communities nearby, such as Park Slope, contributes to poor air quality and especially nitrogen oxides. So Sunset Park, the Community Board 7 area that encompasses Sunset Park, has a higher concentration of nitrogen oxides than the borough of Brooklyn and New York City in general. So I want to give a little bit of historical context to the peaker plants in Sunset Park because this history is not new. So the Gowanus and Narrows facilities, they're 640 and 352 megawatts respectively, and they were built in the early 1970s, 1970, 1971, 1972. So these are old facilities. They're over 50 years old, past the lifespan that they should have, and they don't have any of the modern emissions control technologies that newer power plants have. So what does that mean? That means that these power plants, when they do come on for the very limited amount of time each year during peak demand, they emit a lot of air pollution, especially nitrogen oxides. And even though they only operate for a small percentage of the time, that contribution to ozone, to respiratory illness is outsized, especially in Sunset Park. In addition to these older facilities, NYLPI built the Joseph Seymour Peaker in the early 2000s, and this is a 94 megawatt facility. Again, it's newer, but it still pollutes. As you see in this image, the Joseph Seymour plant is literally across the street from where people live. And of course, what is it across the street? What's between the homes and the industry, the waterfront? It's the BQ8, it's another source of polluting infrastructure. And so NYPA in the early 2000s, when they were building out peaker plants across the city, again, cited in low-income communities of color, they said these power plants would be temporary. And unfortunately, more than 20 years later, they're still here. UPROSE and the Sunset Park community also fought a separate 520 megawatt peaker plant and successfully defeated that. So in the words of our executive director, it feels like for Sunset Park, the fight against peaker plants has been going on for more than 20 years. So to address the air quality issues created by peaker plants, like Seth said, the Department of Environmental Conservation finalized its NOx, nitrogen oxide rule, in 2019. And this is the same year that the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was passed, mandating a zero emissions grid by 2040. So despite this regulatory and legal framework that establishes the closure of these power plants, the owners of the Gowanus facility, Eastern Generation, now Alpha Gen, they submitted a proposal in 2019 to repower this aging facility. So instead of just shutting it down and replacing it with renewable energy, it would be repowered with more fossil fuels. And of course, UPROSE and the Sunset Park community organized and fought back. And ultimately, this resulted in Eastern Generation withdrawing their proposal after two different peakers in New York, in Astoria and Newburgh, New York, were rejected by the State Department of Environmental Conservation that the power plants were inconsistent with the state climate law. So of course, Sunset Park, UPROSE, we celebrate. This is good news. The renewable future that we've been asking for and demanding for is on its way, correct? Next slide. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. There has been unwelcome news, and this renewable future has been halted. So Gowanus and Narrows, because of their age, more than 50 years old, and their lack of compliance with new tighter emission standards by the Department of Environmental Conservation, they were expected to retire in May of 2025, so not too far from now. However, the independent system operator, the state grid entity that is responsible for managing the electrical system overall, announced that there would be a reliability gap in 2025. So approximately 446 megawatts of capacity would be needed by the peakers in the area. And unfortunately, the independent system operator issued a reliability must run contract. So basically, despite the peaker rule mandating that these aging polluting facilities must close, there is an exception that in the case of reliability constraints, these peakers are allowed to continue polluting communities. And of course, that's unacceptable. That is contrary to the principles of environmental justice, and Sunset Park will continue to breathe disparately polluted air, unfortunately. But why was this the case? Why is this preventable? What could have been done instead? Well, fortunately, as Seth mentioned, about half of the Gowanus capacity was retired or plans to retire ahead of 2025. But because of this reliability must run contract, it will continue to, the other half will continue to be in operation until May 2027, that and Narrows. And so there's not much clarity about how much this reliability must run contract costs. It's a confidential contract, I believe. But we do know from past years, from the Dirty Energy Big Money report that the Peak Coalition released in 2020, that every year the Gowanus and Narrows facilities earn about approximately $90 million combined in capacity payments. So just sitting around waiting for the grid operator to say, hey, there's a reliability need, these peakers need to come on. But we know that this is an inefficient use of public resources. We know that Con Ed issued a request for proposals to meet this reliability demand, and in the end, only 30 megawatts of a battery storage solution by one developer was proposed. Con Ed and the rest of the private sector did not come up with adequate solutions to meet this reliability constraint. So, of course, this is, like I said, this is unacceptable. People will continue to breathe disparately polluted air. This is a sacrifice of the health of Sunset Park residents, as well as the money that they pay for this dirty power that could be used for the just transition that they've been advocating for years. And so I will finish the rest of the slide. Sam, could you do the rest of the, oh, there we go, sorry. So instead of, yeah, there we go. So instead of replacing peaker plants and developing wind and solar energy, as well as battery storage and other demand response and renewable energy technologies along the waterfront, which comes out of our community-based plan for a just transition in Sunset Park, the state's vision is to continue the use of these floating power plants. They're not even on land. They're literally sitting on barges, just waiting to pollute communities like Sunset Park. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Point CDC to talk more about what this human health impact is and their perspective in Hunts Point.
Hi, my name is Davila. I am a community organizer with the Point CDC. Trying to make sure the next slide happens. 1 second.
Sorry about that.
There we go. Thank you. So the Point CDC is an arts and cultural center in the South Bronx, but we also work a lot with environmental justice groups. The arts and cultures that we get involved in, making sure that youth have education, after-school programming, extracurricular activity, those things all get severely disrupted by the environmental impacts we have to face every day. And over the years, the Points has found itself getting more and more involved in environmental justice work because it's kind of a survival necessity. So that's kind of the background of who we are and why we do this work. We need to make sure that our future generations aren't being severely impacted because they're currently being severely impacted. Next slide, please. So this is the Cross Bronx Expressway. What happens in Sunset Park is mirrored across communities throughout New York City and across the United States, quite frankly. In Hunts Point, we have the Sheridan, the Cross Bronx Expressway, and the Bruckner. These kind of create an iron triangle of death. Hunts Point is also home to the second largest community food market in the world, which means we have 22,000 trucks coming in and out of our community every day. We are also in radius to 2 different peaker plants. We have a multitude of NOx sources coming in and out of our community every day, having a severe impact on the development of children in the area. This is what I'm going to be covering primarily. So in Hunts Point, we have some of the highest asthma rates in the United States. 1 in 3 kids have asthma, 1 in 4 adults have asthma. As someone who used to be a resident of Hunts Point, I have asthma. It's directly impacted my life and the life of many of my friends. But while asthma is one almost more famous impact of these pollutants, there are other really severe impacts. The Bronx is 62 out of 62 for health impacts in New York State, and a part of that is because of our environmental quality. NOx pollution has been known to increase stroke risk by thickening the blood, constricting veins and arteries, and increasing blood pressure, kind of an immediate cocktail for this kind of impact. My own father, who worked in the Hunts Point food market most of his life, suffered one of these strokes. He was before this kind of strong as a bull, but years of having to breathe in this air meant that he was at peak risk. He's thankfully fine, but not all communities have their family members having the chance to make it out the other side of that. NOx pollution also impacts the cognitive development of children. Over the last 7 years, we have had more and more studies going into the direct connection between cognitive development and pollution. NOx pollution impacts cognitive development in children, and if you have a heat map of where you have some of the highest rates of NOx pollution and where there are some of the highest rates of neurodivergence involving ADHD and other such developmental issues, they line up 1-to-1. So we are not only impacting our kids physically in the immediate, we are hamstringing their capacity to have long-term lives that can be fulfilling. Right? So the need to get rid of these plants go beyond immediate health impacts. They generationally impact our youth. Because they generationally impact our youth, the Point through the Peaker Coalition has been looking to try to create infographics that can communicate to everyday people what these impacts look like. An example is on the screen right now. This is something that my father can read, a man who didn't get his GED but can understand this document, and our kids in program can read. Every time we have community festivals, we bring out these flyers to try to inform people about the dangers of peaker plants and about what battery storage can do for them. The work that the Peaker Coalition does is kind of the bare minimum we owe workers and youth to make sure that there's a speedy recovery. We need to make sure that these communities can get into a space where they can move past these impacts and start developing for themselves, because we are severely damaging them until we move past this. What the work the Clean Energy Group does also advances this, obviously, and it's been phenomenal to be a part of this. That's, I think, all I have for folks now. Folks have Q&A questions towards the end about what other community impacts see on the ground. I'd be happy to answer that. But I think we can pass it off to the next speaker.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. My name is Megan Carr. I'm at NYLPI, as Seth said, and I'm going to talk to you about the barriers in the clean energy transition and to shutting down New York City's peaker plants that we've identified in our report. And I'm going to talk to give you an overview of all of the barriers and then a little more in depth about some of these really salient issues. So the first barrier that we've identified is rising demand. And by this, we're referring to the electrification of buildings and vehicles, which is putting significant new demands on the electric grid and shifting the time of day when peak demand occurs. Another barrier we've identified that my colleague Sebastian already talked about is maintaining reliability. So the NYSA was responsible for ensuring a reliable electric grid, and this is a legitimate and vital concern because blackouts and brownouts can quite literally cost people their lives. But as Sebastian already discussed, the reason that we've had this reliability deficit identified as early as 2025 is not a lack of available technology, it's a lack of action and will when there were 4 years between the passage of the peaker rule and the identification of this reliability deficit where clean energy development could have been built out. We've also identified uncertain renewable energy economics. So energy storage development is obviously a multi-year process. The past few years have seen supply chain interruptions and delays due to a global pandemic, which impacted many of the state's major energy projects that would have reduced reliance on peaker plants. Global conflicts, inflation, and rising interest rates have also raised the costs associated with these projects. And as we saw with the ACE petition to the Public Service Commission, some developers are concerned that their profit margins are much, much smaller than they anticipated when making their bids. We've also identified regulatory barriers, and by this we're referring to the especially strict laws and regulations around energy storage development that we have in New York City because of our unique urban landscape and the risk associated with it. And lastly, false solutions. Fossil fuel interests continue to push false solutions, including burning blue or green hydrogen and so-called renewable natural gas in power plants, because these solutions allow them to continue operating fossil fuel infrastructure. And these solutions are false. Burning any color of hydrogen results in high levels of NOx emissions, which is not safe for our communities, as Victor was just talking about, and hydrogen is itself an indirect greenhouse gas. Focusing on these false solutions is a very expensive distraction from meeting the goals of the CLCPA. Okay. I think I might need the next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to go into a little more detail about two of these. First, I want to talk about rising demand. Even though demand is rising from major electrification, such as New York City's, building decarbonization law, Local Law 97, electrification also presents new opportunities that are very much in reach, such as demand response systems and virtual power plants. By demand response, I'm referring to programs that call on and incentivize commercial and residential customers to reduce their energy usage or even discharge energy during times of peak demand. thus eliminating the need for peaker plants. Con Ed currently has one in place, a demand response system, but it has limited enrollment and needs to be far more robust to maximize benefits and strengthen reliability in the face of this rising demand. Virtual power plants work in a similar way, but refers to aggregated customer resources that can respond to utility and grid signals to increase or decrease demand. So while this increased demand on the electric grid is real, the mass electrification underway actually presents new opportunities for creating a more responsive and reliable grid than we've had before. Next slide, please. Thank you. And lastly, I want to talk about regulatory barriers. There are real challenges to developing battery storage in New York City. The city has additional codes and safety standards beyond the state standards when it comes to siting battery storage. FDNY has a site-specific approval process, for every potential energy development. There are setback and clearance requirements that limit the possibility of rooftop solar across the city. There are fire code regulations that continue to prevent lithium-ion batteries from being installed indoors. And the second use of lithium-ion batteries is banned in New York City. And these limitations stem from real safety concerns. We've all been horrified by the deadly e-bike fires that we've read about in the news. But to increase energy storage development in New York City without sacrificing safety, we need greater education for the public and policymakers alike. That looks at the nuance between different types of battery storage and does not just fearmonger in the public about the risk of battery storage. And lastly, we need incentives such as tax exemptions for energy storage development in New York State. And these exemptions already exist for other technologies, including solar and fossil fuel, a number of types of fossil fuel electricity generators. And where they exist for these other technologies and not energy storage, the price of energy storage is kept artificially high in comparison. And to conclude in talking about these challenges, the Peak Coalition has discussed these and all of the proposed solutions and ways to address them in our report, and these are based on existing technologies and concepts already in practice elsewhere. And we can acknowledge these legitimate challenges in the clean energy transition and in shutting down the city's peaker plants, but it's also important to reject the assumption that the status quo is working, which comes up when you hear a lot of people talking about these challenges. So when we talk about reliability concerns, we also have to remember that our current grid is not reliable, that having over 70% of our downstate energy generated by fossil fuels that we're buying on a volatile global market that's subject to price spikes is not actually reliable. That when we're talking about uncertain economics, the cost of peak electricity in New York City, which is 1,300% higher than the average cost of other electricity in the state, those are not reasonable economics. That means there are over 600,000 New Yorkers paying over 6% of their annual income in energy payments, and that is untenable. And most importantly, as Sebastian and Victor already touched on, the status quo is unacceptable because it requires that some of our communities are sacrificed and regularly exposed to harmful air quality, which has devastating health effects. So as we discuss the challenges in the transition away from peaker plants, let us not forget the significant challenges that many of our communities are already coping with. And with that, I will pass it to Daniel.
So we've talked throughout this webinar a lot about what are the problems and where we've identified the challenges and issue and some of the history surrounding why Peak Coalition does the work that we do. And the questions that we also want to answer to a certain extent here is what is to be done. We've seen a lot of challenges from storage fires to the lack of battery storage being developed and renewables delayed throughout New York City and New York State. And we want to make this transition happen in a just way. So we're talking about a just transition. That means that it's not right that we are transitioning from, it's not enough that we're transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables and energy storage, but we must do it in a just way that takes care of the communities that it has historically impacted. So in our opinion, and from our research, the strategic transition to renewable energy and storage should come with a lot of local benefits and impacts, especially for a lot of the disadvantaged and environmental justice communities that these peaker plants are sited at. We've done a lot of work across renewable energy in New York City Environmental Justice Alliance with our members and with our national partners. And here are some of the principles that I think we came up with that we should center around for peaker plants transition process. So making sure that we respect community self-determination, making sure that as we transition from peaker power to renewable energy and battery storage, low-income communities can still afford and access clean energy and afford them at the same rate that they are currently, if not cheaper than before. Make sure that career opportunities are provided at every level. And I use the word career here because it's not just about a temporary job, but it's about something that can be developed long term. We want to pursue the transition without any false solutions. So thinking about hydrogen combustion or other alternative energy resources that actually produces more NOx emissions in local communities than current fossil fuel technologies. We want to make sure that those are not considered part of our future, and currently they are, in our view, not in compliance with the clean CLCPA's 100% emissions reduction by 2040 rule. We also want to make sure that any kind of transition will allow some sort of community governance in renewable energy and battery storage without any challenges to reliability and resiliency. We also want to make sure that throughout this transition, we are able to remediate relationships with historical impacted communities, the ecosystem, and also make sure that the long-term wealth of the community that these peaker plants are sited at and transitioning from is able to be developed. So we've, from our report, laid out what a roadmap to success looks like in the near term for us. New York City's efforts to phase out peaker plants needs to strategically balance between energy demand, community priorities, regulatory challenges, and storage and renewable development. So these are all factors that need to be considered when transitioning away from fossil fuels to make sure that this is a just transition, not just any energy transition. From this roadmap, we've identified several barriers that I think we need to address. First of all, we've identified barriers on, as Megan mentioned, on several levels. So what is the different levels of agencies and governance structures able to do about this? From the executive office of the governor, we believe that the governor has a lot of leeway in addressing short-term reliability. So thinking about how do we address the 400 or so megawatt shortfall that the NYSO has estimated for 2025, making sure that the governor issues development of storage on time and in a speedy manner, and also making sure that a lot of transmission lines, such as Champaign Hudson and Clean Path New York, delivering clean energy from upstate to downstate is able to be done in a timely manner. The legislature can fund and mandate new solutions. There are several bills in Albany right now, such as the Pollution Justice Act, the Just Energy Transition Act, and several other legislation that will fund and mandate new solutions that will address the reliability challenges, but also making sure that in the long term, the transition from peaker power to renewable energy and battery storage can be done in an equitable way. There are also federal legislations like the Peaker Act and the Justice Empowerment Permitting Act that has been introduced in the past few Congresses that could be potentially helpful for addressing the disproportionate impact peaker plants has on communities. NYSERDA and the Department of Public Services can push to regulate utilities and making sure that the large-scale RFPs, such as the offshore wind solicitations, are deeply tied to battery storage in a way that we currently are not seeing. There is a lot of potential in enhancing the efficacy of both renewables, large-scale renewables, and battery storage if they are paired together. And it is in our view that in the future, that these solicitations need to be more closely linked together to make sure that we are actually maximizing the benefits of energy storage and large-scale renewables at the same time. On a municipal level, there are also things that the city and the utility can do directly. In New York City, There's currently one conversion of a boiler to peaker plant on Rikers Island that's currently undergoing. In our view, there is no need for new peaker plants in New York City, as we've addressed, and especially in the Astoria Asma Alley, converting a boiler on Rikers Island into a new peaker plant is certainly unacceptable in our view. And as Megan has pointed out, there are a lot of regulatory challenges and barriers in a city level that can be done as well. There should be reforms on how we are addressing the siting and safety issues of battery storage, but also making sure that renewables and different kinds of technologies that enable us to be more energy efficient can be cited in these communities. Thinking about local law 97 implementation in New York City, and in particular, the electrification of a lot of these large buildings. We're not saying that they shouldn't be done. In fact, we are encouraging the electrification of a lot of these facilities, but can this be done in a way that is paired with demand management systems? And that leads us to also addressing utility issues such as Con Edison's current demand response system. The DPS issued in 2015 a targeted demand management program for Con Edison. But in our view, there needs to be a much more scaled up system of demand response and demand management, not just about reducing consumer demand and ratepayer demand at peak hours, but also thinking about newer forms of demand management systems and aggregation systems like virtual power plants in order to make sure that all of these factors can be combined together to reduce or manage the increase in demand in a reasonable way that also can accommodate for the retirement of a lot of these fossil fuel peaker plants. So we're continuing the work of our community-led processes to spur renewable energy and battery storage development, improve energy efficiency, and democratize energy management for health and justice. These are some of the limited steps that, in our view, in our research, that we think a lot of these agencies and authorities can do, but these are not sort of the end all be all. There needs to be a much more community-led processes across all levels of the state to make sure that community vision is respected, as going back to the 10 principles that we laid out earlier, that the work of transitioning off peaker power plants is not just done willy-nilly, but in a way that actually prioritizes the disadvantaged communities that these peaker power plants are sited in. And I think that's all of our presentation. So now we're open to questions.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for those great presentations. I know we just threw a whole lot of information at everybody. We probably threw it too quickly. But yeah, we're going to shift to the questions and answers. And for once, we actually have plenty of time to get through a good number of questions, which is great. We've had a number come in. A few of those have been answered just as folks have been talking, but I'm going to start running through these now. I'm actually going to take the first one, this question. I just wanted to make it clear about technologies we're talking about here. The steam turbines versus the combustion turbines. The reason, these are all fossil fuel power plants. Most of them are primarily gas. A number of them are dual fuel, where they can run on fuel oils, distillate fuel oils as well, usually during the winter when gas supplies can be constrained. Those are even worse than burning fracked gas. But the steam turbines are just a different type of power plant, a different type of turbine that is used. They are generally used more for what's known as baseload power, where they operate more of the time consistently. But these ones are being operated just like the other ones as peaker plants. So just being called on when the grid is stressed. And when they're operated inefficiently, they can be very, very dirty. They're not subject to the DEC's emissions rule, because that was specifically targeted to these combustion turbines, which are notoriously high polluting because they're ramping up and down, and they're inefficient in the way they operate and produce high levels of NOx. They've been found to produce over 90% of the NOx emissions on high ozone days for the power sector in New York. So that's why they were targeted, and the steam turbines were not. But all of them are subject to the CLCPA and bringing the grid to zero emissions. So there was another question that came in, just asking about, for batteries that are being proposed for New York City, what are the power sources that will generate power to be stored in the batteries? Which is a great question. I can take this a first pass and then open it up. The reason that New York City has so many peakers to start with is because it's a very constrained area. There's not a lot of transmission capacity for outside energy. Most of the renewables in New York State are outside of New York City. There's not a lot of transmission line capacity during peak demand times to get that energy into the city. So batteries either will need to be charged during those non-peak periods in order to be able to manage that peak demand, or from in-city power. And a lot of that is going to be coming from offshore wind development. And the hope is, and some of the projects that have been proposed are going to be tying the interconnection points for offshore wind with battery storage projects. So there's going to be that direct tie between the renewable offshore wind powering the batteries. So I don't know, anybody else wanted to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. Currently, I think New York City is running on over 90% fossil fuels. Certainly, batteries would be charging off some of the steam power or gas turbines that are being cited in New York City. But obviously, as the transition happens, more and more of these battery storage will be charged by renewable energy. And that is not to say that we shouldn't be citing batteries in New York City at the same time. It's because even on a utility scale, if you have storage in New York City, you can eliminate a lot of the peak power, the peaker plants that are dirtier, and charge them with baseload power plants are slightly cleaner than these peaker power plants. So there is still an immediate health benefit and climate benefit when it comes to citing batteries, even before renewables come online and charging batteries exclusively with renewables. So it's not an either or, it's not whether or not batteries should be prioritized over renewables. I think it's very much that we need to have both at the same time, and there are real concrete benefits of having energy storage coming online as soon as possible in the landscape that we have right now, which is still around 13 or so peaker plants operating across New York City. Great,
thanks, Daniel. This is more of a statement than a question, but I'd love to get folks' take on it. This is, we need to drive down a NYSO's claim, this is the New York system operator, that we need to keep ancient, inefficient, expensive fossil plants online due to a power shortage. In many ways, this is the fox watching the hen house. This is putting more clearly that the ISO is responsible for taking 5 years for battery site applications and also for the process to get solar in place. So I don't think this is anything that we would disagree with, but I'm just curious if anybody has any additional comments on that.
I think there are certainly challenges regarding NYSO's estimate for a few hundred megawatts of shortfall, but at the same time, we have to recognize that the CLCPA was passed in 2019. The peaker rule was finalized around 2019-2020 as well. And so there has been plenty of time for New York State to understand what the landscape of energy demand and rising electrification put on the grid. And so there has been quite some time that has passed, 3 to 4 years, that the state has for preparing a lot of these shortfalls that could potentially come up. And yes, there might be some shortfall. There should be challenges to how much of a shortfall New York City has in the future in 2025. But we also must recognize that it's not just a result of NYSO's estimation. It is also a result of inaction, deliberate inaction on state and city's part to make sure that we are in the place we are today. And so the question now is, how do we address them in a very quick manner that doesn't enable a lot of these rules that are circumventing the peaker rule to continue operating.
Right. So Megan, you had mentioned that you mentioned false solutions. A question just came in asking if any of the power plants have proposed switching to hydrogen or using hydrogen in fuel cells.
I feel like you would have better answer to that than me.
Yeah, well, I mean, we certainly saw that in the energy proposal. They did propose, they said, well, eventually we will burn hydrogen. Essentially, DC did not fall for that. They said they provided no evidence indicating that that was a viable path forward and also didn't address the zero emission side of the CLCPA. One demonstration has happened in the New York City area. NYLPI, they have a Brentwood power plant on Long Island. So they did do a test pilot project where they had to truck in green hydrogen in trucks in order to test blending with natural gas. As Peak Coalition and work that Clean Energy Group has done have indicated, it showed that as the levels of hydrogen increased in the blend, the level of NOx emissions also increased, which is what all of the science has pointed to, that burning hydrogen actually emits NOx at a higher rate than burning just gas. They were only able to keep it in control by using a technique that involved a lot more water use, which also has its issues. So it has been proposed, and a number of folks in the fossil fuel industry are continuing to try to get it in there, but fortunately, that has not happened. It does not seem like it's going to happen at this point in New York.
Yeah, I think since Energy Astoria, there hasn't been another proposal to power plants with hydrogen fuel in a combustion manner in New York City, although there are still cases going on, I think in Danskemmer and in Dover, where power plants are proposing to use hydrogen. And that is not to say that these are the only proposals, and there will be no new proposals coming into New York City that proposes to use hydrogen combustion as the technology. We haven't done as much work on the hydrogen fuel cell side, simply because hydrogen fuel cell doesn't have the same level of public health implications that combusting hydrogen has in New York City, and or frankly anywhere, since they don't generate NOx emissions the same way that hydrogen combustion does. So that's an area that we haven't done a lot of studies on and research on, but the same concerns as Seth mentioned about trucking hydrogen fuel exist for hydrogen fuel cells. And yeah, there are still infrastructural concerns we have around some of these technologies. We're not saying no to hydrogen or no to hydrogen entirely. We're just saying that we need to proceed with caution about some of these new technologies that are coming on in comparison to large-scale renewables and battery storage, where there is a more proven scalable way that we can do to reduce peaker demand.
Great. Question for Victor, which I think I know the response to, but just can we get a copy of the peaker impact flyer? I would like to share it when communicating with relevant key decision makers.
Yeah, absolutely. We have two different ones. One is about the battery storage as a peaker, and another one is about hydrogen. There'll be a third produced hopefully by the end of this week. Something I also wanted to kind of key on to, that like how different kinds of new legislation interacts with these technologies. As we know, hydrogen is not necessarily an option in certain circumstances, but if combustion hydrogen in New York continues as cap and trade moves forward, cap and trade in the West Coast resulted in a lot of companies being able to place their pollutants legally in Black and brown communities at an excessive rate. And if high NOx emission hydrogen facilities go online as a way to kind of circumvent CO2 standards, because NOx pollution is not like fully involved in the kind of like what counts as a greenhouse gas and what counts towards the COCPA standards, that has the risk of potentially dumping those kinds of facilities into these communities should cap and trade move forward, because it seems to be close to modeling what happened in the West Coast right now. So those are also potential like things that we have to keep an eye out for in the future, because there's synergy with bad decisions. But no, sorry, to answer the immediate question, yes, I can share the slides.
So yeah, Victor, if you wouldn't mind sending that up to Samantha, we can, I think we can include that when we send out the recording as well. Make sure everybody has the flyer. Actually, this is a good lead in. There's a question specifically about the Cap and Invest, a webinar last month that noted that individually controlled permitted stationary sources, including electric generating units, large industrial sources, and large commercial and institutional sources, represent approximately 4% of total emissions for inhalable air pollution burdens in New York. Area and mobile sources dominate, which means that individual stationary source-focused policy is important, but doesn't address the bulk sources. and existing policies will go a long way in addressing sources of emissions from the electric sector. So it's kind of a long question, but I would love responses to that.
So I'm going to respond. Go ahead, Victor.
Well, to clarify, this is talking about like the difference between regulating stationary pollution sources and mobile pollution sources like traffic.
Sounds like it, yeah.
The things like that are difficult to control for residents and like individual drivers, like just regular civilian drivers, but there needs to be a larger effort to transition what we know for distribution sources. Right, one of the largest, like aside from pedestrian drivers, commercial vehicles are one of the larger things that we have to try to control for, because we know when they're going out, they have shipping schedules, we have higher capacity to actually regulate them. There are some efforts happening to transition how this works. In Hunts Point, there's going to be an electrical truck depot that's going to be built out that should help encourage EVs into that area. But in general, this is the only opinion I have to offer, and we'll end after this. It should begin with that kind of small rollout, right? Making sure that we are impacting commercial regulation first, and then from there you can model how are we going to deal with residential and just civilian drivers.
Yeah, adding on to that, I think the person mentioned 4% of stationary sources are in New York State, but just because those are 4% doesn't mean the 4% are distributed equally across New York State. We see in New York State, a lot of these peaker facilities are located in disadvantaged communities, in South Bronx, in Sunset Park, and in other areas of Brooklyn and across New York City. So those 4% are concentrated in areas that are extremely poor, has high asthma rates, and has a lot of impacts from environmental damages already. Just adding on to what Victor mentioned about trucking in the South Bronx, South Bronx has 2 NYLPI peaker plants. They're very close to Astoria, where there's a bunch of other peaker plants, and there are over 10,000 trucks going through the South Bronx every day for last mile distribution, for food distribution, etc. And so you can see how the concentration of these industrial activities can cause a lot of emissions to be concentrated in one area, both mobile sources and stationary sources. So the answer is not to just address one or focus on one but not the other, but a comprehensive effort to make sure that we can electrify these trucks, we can reduce the emissions coming from these mobile sources, but at the same time making sure that the sources that are fueling the electricity for the electrified trucks in the future are coming from cleaner energy sources and not from a new power plant that's powering a lot of these transfer refrigeration units or heavy duty vehicles. And that's most evident, I think, in the South Bronx and a few other areas like Sunset Park as well. But there needs to be a sort of both solutions, not an either or. I would encourage you to check out some of the work of Electrify New York and the Last Mile Coalition that's done some work on truck electrification that I think UPROSE and the Point are also part of as well to a certain extent. And yeah, obviously the Peak Coalition, we're focusing on the power sector and how we can make sure that the transition to a fully zero emissions electricity system doesn't place any further burdens on the communities that these peaker plants are sited in.
So one last thing that Daniel reminded me of is that there's that 4% and it's concentrated. Those areas it's concentrated in also incredibly population dense areas. Right? Hunts Point is one neighborhood that has 11,000 registered residents. So that's not including people who are undocumented immigrants in the area. So it's 4%, but it also represents impacting very densely clustered populations.
I'll also add UPROSE, like the Point CDC and other member organizations of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. We're focused on regulating and combating those environmental injustices, whether they're mobile or stationary sources. And so, like Daniel and Victor said, this is an all of the above strategy. We're mitigating the air pollution emissions from peakers, as well as last mile distribution facilities, polluting infrastructure like highways. And I'll also say that even if most of this pollution that comes from is coming from mobile sources, that doesn't mean that the impact of peakers isn't important. I will say it's negative for our pocketbooks, it's negative for our public health, and negative for our planet. It costs a lot in terms of the human impacts, the economic impacts, and that enough should be motivation to improve air quality and move towards renewable energy in our communities.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I want to, the question I want to make sure we hit on. isn't replacing peakers with batteries, just displacing injustice from New York City to Africa, referencing child labor. This is an important point, and there are some very serious issues with certain battery storage technologies. I'm assuming that the reference to child labor is talking about cobalt supplies. And this is mainly a large source of this is the Congo. And there are some serious social issues, including child labor for sourcing of cobalt. One positive trend in the battery storage industry is a move from what are called nickel, magnesium, cobalt, lithium-ion batteries to lithium iron phosphate, which does not actually use cobalt. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some serious issues with mining practices for the other metals as well. Lithium can have some serious environmental impacts, and the industry needs to work on cleaning that up and focusing on recycling the lithium that we do have. I think it's a very important point to note that there are often trade-offs when you're looking at how we're going to do this transition, and we need to remain aware of the sourcing of the raw materials that go into that, the processes involved, and all the injustices that can happen along the way, and make sure we hold those industries as accountable as possible to make sure that these injustices are not perpetuated. If anyone else want to chime in on that question.
I'll also add, part of our strategy isn't just batteries and renewable energy deployment. It's also energy efficiency and addressing the massive peaks of electricity demand that happen in the first place. The reasons why we need peaker plants at all. And so, in Sunset Park, part of our community-based plan, the Grid 2.0, which I encourage people to check out, it calls for electrification, which will, because of the advanced technology, especially compared to older facilities like peaker plants, even just gas boilers, will reduce the amount of energy used in general. So I think that's also important to consider, that it's not just changing where this electricity comes from, changing how much electricity is being used.
Yeah, there are absolutely challenges with raw material extraction for a lot of these new technologies, including battery storage. But that is not to say that there are no human rights implications for a lot of the existing fossil fuel technologies that also run on a certain number of raw materials that are from rare earth that are mined in places like Congo, like Chile. I definitely recognize that there are resource extraction challenges from places like Chile and indigenous territories and nations in North America as well for lithium extraction. But there are currently not enough lithium in the world for us to use if we want to mine all of them and use them for all of our electric vehicles to electrify every single car in the country, if not the world. So there needs to be a more comprehensive understanding of where do we want to place these resources in an efficient manner, in a manner that actually doesn't place an exclusive burden on the communities that we're extracting these raw materials from. So instead of asking, okay, we have to extract new lithium, how can we recycle existing lithium-ion batteries from used EVs into utility scale battery storage, which is something that can absolutely be done. How can we make sure that we can reduce the overall demand for large lithium-ion batteries in order to reduce the amount of resource extraction that we need to be doing? And also, P Coalition is somewhat involved, and I know Seth and NYC-EJA is more involved in the development of long duration energy storage technologies and newer energy storage technologies. It doesn't require as much extraction of raw materials and resources. So that's something that we're absolutely working on as well, to make sure that we can minimize those as much as possible. And also, whenever issues like that come up, and we've heard this from even indigenous nations in New York State as well, make sure that we respect the voices of people who occupy those lands and territories, and making sure that their concerns are heard, and that we are able to do some work from our extent in New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, across our National Climate Justice Alliance, to make sure that a lot of these concerns can be addressed.
Great. There's a question. Oh, sorry, Victor, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to appreciate bringing that up at all, because it's going to always be the elephant in the room. The legacy of King Leopold kind of led to this. The extraction of rubber in the Congo is what led to the fertile ground of general exploitation that now exists for other resource-rich materials in that region. there is always a question of the invisible cost of something. Electricity in New York is arguably incredibly expensive, but it would be much more expensive if community members weren't paying the cost with their long-term livelihood, right? There's that hidden cost behind doing that kind of business. And as folks who are in this space and folks who are on this panel continue to push for these issues, that needs to be something constantly kept in mind, because if battery storage for the sake of the renewable transition is going to take off, it means that there's more capacity to demand that the market shift in that way, right? So like the example that I immediately think of is that McDonald's changed the beef industry. McDonald's was the largest buyer of beef in the United States for years, and they wanted all their patties to taste the same. And so it forced a separate industry entirely to shift how it reared their beef to meet that high demand. So if we enter this space, at every opportunity, we have to demand better from whoever is supplying these things, whoever is producing these things, because we are going to be, hopefully, the renewable space will be the largest consumer of these things, which means that they can potentially force ethical standards where they weren't before.
Okay. Question came in, is it saying that the PJM interconnection, which is the Mid-Atlantic region independent system operator, significantly reduced capacity payments, causing independent power plant owners to stop plans for more gas plants in New Jersey. Has NYSO found the same issues, that they don't need high capacity payments to ensure adequate supplies? Take a first pass at this one. You know, what we found in our Dirty Energy report was that capacity payments are extremely high in New York City due to that constraint of transmission, of getting power into the city. So that means that the resources that are remaining in the city, these old peaker power plants, are extremely valuable for the capacity that they can provide. And until alternative resources to either get more energy in, which there's some transmission lines that are under development right now that will help ease that strain, or we can get new generation within the city, whether it's offshore wind or distributed solar or distributed batteries, the capacity payment is going to remain high for these power plants. What needs to be done is we need to make sure that some of that value is reallocated so that these new clean resources can be developed in the city, which just hasn't been done to this point. A good question here. What are the consequences of not meeting the statutory carbon-free and emissions-free mandates by the respective deadlines? So I don't know if anyone wants to take a first crack at that one.
I'd say there are severe consequences in terms of air pollution and the amount of money people are going to pay for energy, as well as, of course, climate change. As Megan and Daniel mentioned, electrification of buildings and vehicles, that's a big source of energy in terms of consumption. And so if these peaker plants, they continue to be delayed in their retirement, all this excess electricity demand that's coming out of needed electrification, that poses a very real risk that these peaker plants will be needed to meet this additional energy demand from renewable energy technology or electrification technologies. And so it risks perpetuating that use and reliance on peaker plants rather than curtailing it now.
Yeah, I could say that in the peaker rule, the DEC emissions rule, it's a little unclear as far as my understanding of it. There is this out for reliability that allows for past the 2025 emissions reduction deadline. There is a 2-year out for reliability, so you can extend the use of that for 2 years, and then you can extend it for another 2 years, for a total of 4 years. What happens after then is not spelled out in the rules as far as I've seen. And I don't know, and Megan or Daniel, if you know in the CLCPA, if there are any binding, what happens if the state fails to meet the requirements it has mandated, or if that's clearly spelled out?
I mean, I don't think it is clearly spelled out. And I think that these sort of like statewide emissions limits, there are difficulties in enforcement that are different when you're talking about regulating like one industry or something, or like identifying, you know, regulatory targets. So like when we have things like the building electrification and building decarbonization, we have clear targets that have to change their behavior, and it's about levying fines to get them to change their behavior. And I think the CLCPA and the sort of emissions targets that are statewide, that are across industries, that are across sectors, you know, actually taking the enforcement actions gets a lot more complicated. Daniel, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think it's clearly spelled out what happens if the state doesn't meet 100 by 40 emissions reduction and net zero by 2050 goals. I think it's very clear from our research and from our end that meeting the 100 by 40 goal is not impossible. In fact, it's very doable. So our focus is on making sure that a lot of these new transmission lines and offshore wind resources and large-scale renewables can be done in a timely and efficient manner to make sure that we hit those goals. 15 years might seem like a lot, but it's also a very short time to make sure that projects will come online and be developed by 2040. And that's our main focus for now, to make sure that we hit zero emissions by 2040 without any hiccups or challenges.
What I'll add is, you know, when we think about this incrementally, is there are enforcement provisions that, you know, we as advocates use at every step along the process. So, you know, every major emitter has to get permitted by the state. And when we see the state taking an action, such as giving a permit that is inconsistent with these climate goals, I mean, that's where there's a clear mechanism, and you challenge based on the violation of the CLCPA. So I guess, you know, we don't want to look at it as like what happens at the end of the line if it's not met. It's every step along the way. We have to be paying attention as advocates, as community organizations, as community lawyers, to ensure that the right decisions are being made by the state entities that are charged with implementing the CLCPA.
Great. And I think, you know, we have time for one or two more questions. Appreciate those of you that have hung on and stuck around with us. And if there are questions we didn't get to, there are a few here, but please do send them our way. So through research with the DSA Public Power Committee, we've documented that NYLPI peakers, such as Harlem River Yard and Hellgate and the South Bronx, have increased in operation over the past 5 years, despite NYLPI's promise to replace peakers with battery storage. For example, Hellgate has increased operation from 62 days in 2019 to 142 days in 2023. Is this increase in operation due to NYSO's reliability findings mentioned earlier? Can NYLPI replace the demand now with battery storage, or is their plan reliant on renewables coming online? So a lot there, some very good questions. I will take a first pass at these. You know, based on, we've had an ongoing conversation with NYLPI. We meet with them regularly, the Peak Coalition. From those conversations and our work with NYLPI, it is not our understanding that any change in use has anything to do with the reliability findings that were mentioned, the reliability gap that NYSO identified. And NYLPI has repeatedly confirmed their intent to replace their peaker plants with battery storage, as they are mandated to do. Now, I will caveat that with the fact that they also make it clear that some of the determination of the replacement is outside of their control, that it depends on what the NYSO says. So if they say we're going to replace Harlem River Yard with battery storage, they send that deactivation notice to NYSO and the notice that they're going to put battery storage there. The NYSO will then run a reliability analysis, find out if that's going to cause a problem or not. That process is a black box for everybody, including NYLPI, as far as our understanding goes, which is not a very transparent way to run the system. We're trying to get more transparency in that, so that we know if that is denied, why, so that you can proactively then develop resources in the right place for meeting those needs. But that process hasn't happened. So hopefully I addressed the question, and yeah, if anyone else wants to jump in on that. But it's a little bit of a black box on the next steps.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's hard to figure out if the NYSO is going to be denying NYPA's ability to transition it from fossil fuel power to battery storage. I can't speak on the reasons why they increased operations by around 60 days since 2019, if given that any changes in operations from a reliability standpoint would happen in 2023 and beyond, given the circumvention of the peaker rule from the NYSO's end. I will say that the challenge that Seth pointed out, we've seen that done with Gowanus and Narrows when NYSO came out and say Gowanus and Narrows cannot stop operations, but has to continue operating because of the peaker rule. So the similar concern exists for NYPA when NYPA eventually publishes the battery storage RFPs for Harlem River Yard and Hellgate. We have to do everything we can from the Peak Coalition and from Public Power Coalition and all the advocates out there to make sure that NYPA doesn't face the same challenges that in NYSO that Eastern Alpha generation has faced on an NYSO level. There, as Seth mentioned, has to be reform on the grid operations level to make sure that there's a lot more transparency, there's a lot more efficiency, and that a lot of the storage and renewables can be, going through the NYSO queue in a lot more efficient manner than it currently is right now.
Okay, well, we've only got a few minutes left, so I think we are going to end the question and answer part right now. Again, thanks for those that stuck with us. We wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to address questions, and thank you so much for all the information and for the responses, Daniel, Sebastian, Victor, and Megan. I have the great pleasure of getting to work with these guys all the time. And it's great getting to do a webinar with everybody. So with that, again, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions. I'm going to turn it over to Samantha if we have any upcoming webinars, and we'll be sending out the recording and slides to everybody shortly.
Thanks, Seth. So we do have an upcoming webinar on February 15th. We've got a webinar with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and they will be presenting their research on solar adopter income and demographic trends. So answering that question of who is getting solar, who has solar. That should be really interesting. They've been doing this research for a long time. It's an annual report they will be presenting updates on. So that's February 15th. We hope you can attend. Thank you, everybody, again. We'll see you next time.